Jasmin, welcome to Dear Diaspora. I'm so happy to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Absolutely, absolutely. Super excited for this conversation. Let's get started by getting to know you just a bit more. Tell us a bit about where you're from and where you grew up.
Yeah, so I am originally from Trenton, New Jersey, which, some people like to say is South Jersey, but it's definitely central. And the way that I like to describe it for people is if you're from Northern Jersey, you probably spend more time in New York. As someone from Trenton, I spend more time in Philly. And yeah, I've spent most of my life there, but I've lived in like many cities in the States. And I guess my maternal grandmother's family is from Virginia. So that's kind of a little bit like further back.
Interesting, interesting. Um, and what would you say shaped your understanding of the African continent growing up? Like, did you have experiences with, different African cultures? Did you learn about it in school?
So definitely did not learn about it in school. Like, I feel like, which is the case for many people growing up in the States. But I did say I was from Trenton. So Trenton has a huge Liberian population / community. So I went to high school with like a number of African students who were from that community as well. And my like first long-term boyfriend was Liberian. And we started dating like towards the end of high school for a really long time. So that's basically like how I really got introduced to African culture, mostly like food and attire and songs through weddings and stuff like that. But yeah, Liberian culture was my first kind of engagement with the continent, I would say.
And so, you go from, a bit of exposure to Liberian culture, around like high school time. Did that shift for you once you got to college, or was it kind of a similar dynamic?
Yeah, so once I got to college, I feel like I was still with that person, right? So like through college as well. So I went to Spelman, shout out to Spelman. And as you know, Morehouse is across the street. So I didn't really spend much time. I didn't really spend much time there. But also, as far as like interacting with more African culture, I will be very honest with you. It was very minimal. I feel like, Spelman is such a like academically driven institution that like you are very focused on like, nah, you know? And but after Spelman is when I got more interested, started thinking a little bit more about, what is my next step, after this path of my career. So that's kind of like, I would say it kind of skipped college and kind of jumped to, okay, what do I want to do with my life? Which is when like thinking about Africa kind of came back into the picture.
Okay, understandable. And so, what would you say inspired your decision to move to the continent?
Honestly, I wish I could say that it was like super intentional. I really wish I was that girl. I've been thinking about, going back to the motherland for as long as I can remember. No, it was not like that. For me, I'm a first generation college student, first in my family to go to college, first in my family to like get a professional degree. So I kind of have been winging career path and life, kind of like, let's see how this goes. I think this is what I'm supposed to do. And I do know what I was very specific on was like, I do want to go abroad. I had been working at a bank for like nearly 5 years. And I knew I was supposed to apply to business school. So basically I was like, all right, what is the next step? And I knew I wanted to go abroad. I didn't do that at Spelman. And then I was just thinking to myself, like, I do want an international experience, but I don't want to go to Europe. I don't want to go to South America. I don't want to go to Asia. I was very, like, I really simply wanted to experience life amongst people who kind of like look like me a little bit. And kind of see like what their lives are like that are very different from mine. And for me, it just kind of felt like it made sense. I'm a Black American, I have some ancestry to the continent. Why not start there? And it turned out to be, of course, much more than I had imagined, but yeah.
Wow. And could you tell us a bit about, so obviously we know each other through the Princeton and Africa Fellowship, and you ended up doing your fellowship in Uganda, correct?
Yeah. I did my fellowship in Kampala, Uganda. It was from 2015 to 2016. And I was working for this infrastructure development organization called Electro Limited. And I was the finance associate / fellow, but I more so just kind of did whatever they asked me to. And I don't know if, you'll talk to a lot of fellows from like Princeton in Africa or Peace Corps or like any fellows where you like have to go and work in an office with another culture. I don't know if they would say that like working in the office with that other culture is the best part of their experience, but that was hands down the best part of living in Uganda. Because when you're working with local people, it's like, I'm interacting with you every day. So I'm seeing what your life is like. I'm seeing how you live, seeing how you move in the world, things that are important to you. So it really gave me a chance to like live among people who look like me, but have very completely different experiences than me.
Wow. That's beautiful. And I feel like that, makes your experience just that much more authentic. So it's awesome that you got to experience that. And what would you say surprised you about living in Africa? Or what do you think, has there been like a common theme? Is there something that continues to surprise you?
Okay, so there are a number of things, but I think one thing that has really surprised me about living on the continent is just how different people think of identity, and how your idea or understanding of identity evolves over time. I like to tell people that when I was in Uganda, a Ugandan would point at me on the street and be like, Mzungu, which is, I think, the Swahili word for white person, right? Or foreigner. And of course, I'm not white. And I mean, for me, a Black American woman, like someone calling me a white woman, the like historical context, I mean, it was just really hard for me to understand so quickly. Or truly understand like quickly. It took some time, which when speaking to my like Ugandan coworkers, I would ask them like, yo, why did this lady call me a white woman? And they would be like, I mean, Jasmin, you're a foreigner. So sometimes kind of people like kind of use that word interchangeably, but you do look different from us. You do sound different from us. And at the time I had my hair like pretty curly and I had like dyed it blonde. So in between braids, I would like have like little wet and goes, which would be very short because I have pretty short hair and coarse hair. But he would even be like, and your hair, like, look at your hair. Like our hair don't do that. But to me, I'm like, wow, that's crazy. Or even thinking about like living in South Africa, right? Coming here and having to really adjust to the Black versus white versus colored like categories of race in this country. And just, me thinking that I'm speaking to someone who might be, a light-skinned South African, and then somebody's like, nah, that's a colored person, So for me, I feel like my idea of identity has just really been like thrown around and
Mm.
really evolved. And I guess I would say like it's just really, I think what I've come away with is like identity is really about how you feel and how you see yourself, in addition to how the world interacts with you most of the time, right?
Mm.
So I can't say that I'm super crystal clear on it, but it's evolving.
Wow, beautiful. I mean, sounds like you're on quite the journey.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to hear even more about, just what you continue to learn about yourself, the more
Yeah.
time that you spend on the continent. And, what you shared reminded me of like a few like interactions I had, like working in Ghana also,
Mhm.
and how there would be, I wanted to kind of maintain my same routines and like, on my way to the office, I would stop at a coffee shop, get me a latte, very bougie. And, when I would get to work, my coworkers would kind of tease me and they'd be like, Obroni, Obroni, which means like white person in tree in, yeah, a language spoken
Yeah.
in Ghana.
Yeah.
And I'd always be like, what? Like, no, like I'm not an Obroni,
Coffee?
but just for getting like a latte before work. Um,
Yeah.
but then it's like in that moment, they were speaking more to, obviously, like I'm a Black person, I'm an African person, but they were speaking more to my Americanness or my foreignness. And so them
Yeah.
using the word Obroni, yeah, they weren't calling me white. They were just saying, girl, you're you're so American, you're so foreign.
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
so it's interesting, like navigating that in like office spaces, especially because then you really get to get a sense of like what people actually like think of you, the impression that you're leaving on people.
Yeah.
It's really powerful.
They they did not, they thought America was crazy. Like they would
Interesting.
specifically say, your problem is y'all are too free, Jasmine. You're too free. Imagine someone telling you that America's too free. And I'm like, what? You guys are nuts.
Interesting.
But in their mind, it was very true because I remember like in the beginning, I'm like at work and I'm being American. I'm eating my lunch at my desk, working through the lunch hour. And everyone would leave for lunch. I'm thinking people are going out to eat lunch. Meanwhile, they're in the back at the table having lunch together every day. So one time one of them walks up to me and is like, what's wrong with you? Straight up, what's wrong with you? I'm like, oh no, nothing, blah, blah. He's like, you don't eat lunch? I'm like, oh yeah, I ate at my desk. He's like, nah, we eat lunch in the room. I'm
Mm,
like, oh, thank you. So during those lunch sessions, is when the sentiment of America's freedom came up because it was around the time when Kim Kardashian was posed somewhere naked. And I mean, they were like, she should be in jail. And I was very
jail.
much like, they were like, she would be in jail if she lived here. And I was like, okay, guys, like that seems a little extreme, maybe you might feel it's inappropriate, but they were very much like, she should be in jail. And I'm like standing up at the table, like, no, women have rights. Women should be able to da da da. And that man turned to me and said, Jasmine, do not come over here with your Western with your Western views. He said, don't bring your Western views over here to Uganda. And the entire table just like burst into laughter. So those are the kind of like really dope, cool, honest, authentic conversations that we used to have. But it really does give you a sense of, so this is what they think of America, right?
Mm,
Which is very cool to see and a little scary.
that's so interesting. And I mean, I feel like it speaks to how a lot of our cultures in Africa are still quite conservative. And so
Mhm.
just to think that, you'd be having that conversation in an environment where people are, obviously working and are maybe even a bit more progressive, like slightly more progressive than the average, like Ugandan. It's interesting
Yeah.
to think that those were their feelings about the Kim Kardashian situation.
Exactly.
So, Jasmin, you've had really great experiences on the continent. What would you say you've had to become accustomed to while living in Africa?
This is a good question. But I would have to say it's a couple of things. So I'll answer this question with two. So first, I would say something that I had to get accustomed to living on the continent as a Black American from very humble beginnings, definitely like lower class family. I think what I had to get accustomed to was kind of the privilege that I had coming here. Especially like in Uganda, where someone sees me as a foreigner, a Mzungu, right? If I was with a group of, it would work with the reverse too. So if I was with a group of Ugandans in Uganda or even here in South Africa, if someone hears my accent, I'm like much more like they might be nicer to me. They want to talk to me specifically. I might hold a little clout, a little bit of weight. People will be, very nice to me, very kind. I find that a lot of the time they think I'm rich, or they think, I don't know, they're just asking me about celebrities a lot. One person in South Africa asked me if I know Cardi B, and I'm like, no, I don't know her. And maybe it's because we're both ratchet. I don't know. But and even when I was in Uganda, like I took the GMAT when I was there. So I'm like at the office studying quite late. And one night, one of my coworkers was there with me. He's doing like some finance work, and he just randomly, I don't even think we were listening to this artist, but he randomly stops what we're listening to. Well, we're in different corners, but he randomly stops what he's listening to. And then he just yells over like, Jasmin. And I'm like, yo, what's up? He's like, is Tupac really dead? Like, what? So it's kind of like, that privilege. And then kind of like being the spokesperson, right? But then the second thing that is a bit more jarring for me has been the question, no, where are you really from? And I mean, I get that question from so many different people of different African nationalities too, like different African countries. They always are like, no, where are you from? And I usually am like, it's like, hey, where are you from? Oh, I'm from Congo. Where are you from? Oh, I'm from the US. No, like, where are you from? Well, no, my family's from New Jersey. No, where are you really from? And I mean, it's usually like 2 to 3 times that I get the question, even though I'm trying to nudge that like, nah, I'm from America. That's it. That's all I know. And I get it a lot. So it gets kind of, it's a little exhausting. And it gets a little awkward and weird because I'm trying to over explain like how my family has been in the US since slavery. So I don't really know where I'm from. And so, yeah, it just gets weird. It gets awkward. And now I'm like the weird person at the club talking about slavery because this man won't let me just be like, I'm from New Jersey. I'm trying to trace my DNA. And I'm like, bro, I don't know. Like, I don't know. And so then it's like when I have to like say slavery, they're like, oh, okay, cool. And then we kind of just move on. So I feel like there's like lack of understanding or knowledge about like the Black American experience, and maybe even African American history. Like I do know that, African people are very aware of slavery, but I feel like it's just not something that is like at the forefront in their minds whenever, you talk to them about certain things, or at least whenever I meet them. I feel like in their mind, they're like, oh, nah, you must be from East Africa. And I'm like, maybe, bro, I don't know.
Interesting.
So that's kind of tough.
I mean, that's such a heavy question.
Yeah.
And so for you to be able to navigate that graciously, I think says a lot. Because I don't think the average person would be able to really handle that well, especially if you're getting a question all the time.
I never said it was graceful all the time, but I'm working on it. This is my like 4th year living on the continent. So
Wow. And would you say you, like over time, you've gotten more comfortable pushing back and more comfortable, like, articulating, like, okay, this is who I am, this is where I'm
yeah,
from, like,
yeah,
or has it been like just as difficult throughout?
that's a good question. I think over time I've just gotten more comfortable because I feel like in the beginning when I'm like, not aggressive, maybe I'm too assertive or too excited or anxious in the way that I'm like answering the question. And plus, again, I find that it's a lot of the time like in the club or at a bar, and it's like, bro, I don't want to talk about this right now. But I will say the last person that asked me that, I kind of just threw the question back at, I didn't throw the question back at them, but I just was like, I find it really interesting that like you as a Nigerian from London would ask me that question like twice, and
Hmm.
that it wasn't like super nice. This was someone from Bumble. However,
Ah,
I do feel like kind of like asking that question and like talking a little bit further, it did make him be like, oh yeah, like you're right. Or like, oh, I wasn't trying to offend you. I just, just letting him know, like, no, I'm not offended. It's just something that I'm like wondering if it's top of mind for people. You're like meeting people around the world, right?
mm,
So if you ask me where I'm from 2 to 3 times and I keep saying the US, um, I'm probably there from generations back.
right, right. I guess it's just interesting to think that you've had like so many of those interactions.
Yeah.
And I wonder if like, I guess I wonder what people are thinking as they're like asking you those questions and
What do
what's
you
like
think?
influencing that.
Yeah.
Yeah, like where
So
that's coming from.
that's a good thought because I feel like the more I talk to different people, like I have a really nice, wonderful friend group that is like complete with people from all over the continent. And which is nice because then I can just kind of like ask them the questions that I want to ask. I can voice my grievances with them and they're like, oh, relax, whatever. Um, but I feel like one of the things that they say about the question is like, this is a very like you're living on the continent, right? We all look a certain way, right? Like we all have melanin and it's really more of like a nationalist. Like what nation are you from? What kind of currency does your passport have? Because
Mm.
I hear your accent and I know that's some kind of currency, but like what does your passport look like? So sometimes that is what the underlying, I think, question is about. But then other times I find that just over my time living on the continent and interacting with so many different African people,
Mhm.
I think it's like also a little bit of pride too, because it's like, where are you from? You from East Africa? You one
Mm.
of us, or you look like you could be from wherever someone might say, like when I was in Zanzibar, someone told me I looked like I could be Tanzanian, right? So I also think it's like that, like pride and like, yeah, who are your people? You could be my people, which I feel like I of course welcome that. Like that's like a very, to me, I find that very endearing.
Mm.
So I mean, it's 50-50, honestly. It could be either of those things.
Right. And I feel like it's a natural thing for people to want to kind of make sense of like, okay, who am
Yeah.
I talking to? What
Yeah.
category do you fit in? Like
Yeah.
I hear the accent, like so I
What
guess
are
it
you
is
doing
a
in this
natural.
country? Like, why are you with us? Like, who are you? Yeah, definitely. Definitely.
Man, but I definitely relate as far as like the people wanting to know, like, if you're, I guess, a part of
Hmm.
their tribe, essentially. Like, I've gotten that a lot, even when we were in Rwanda. Like, I got someone saying, "Oh my gosh, you look Rwandese." And I was like,
Yeah.
"Oh, do I?" I was like, "Thank you. That's cool. I'm glad that that I fit right in."
Yeah.
So I think, I would hope that people aren't attempting to cause harm or cause
Yeah.
trauma. It's like, they're just trying to like figure out where you're from and how they can, I guess, act
Yeah.
accordingly.
Yeah.
But this reminds me a lot of like the Diaspora Wars and just our, this global like misunderstanding of each other. It seems like, and for those that aren't, sorry, were you going to say something?
No, I'm just like, here, bring it. Here we go.
um, yeah. So for those who aren't familiar, the Diaspora Wars can be loosely described as cross-cultural arguments among different ethnicities of African people, where we essentially express discontent with each other for various reasons. And so recently there have been, for decades, there have been lots of examples of this, but more recent examples would be like, when, let's say, like a new film like Black is King comes out, and it's basically received differently across the diaspora. So African folks, continental folks receive it a certain way. Black Americans obviously are going to receive it a certain way. And those are some of the most, I guess, visible examples of like people just really revealing how much we just don't know about each other. And like, I guess it's interesting to think that what we think of like the Diaspora Wars, like we think of them as like maybe these online like virtual arguments, but it's like they are actually real essentially, because they come into play in like our day-to-day lives, our day-to-day interactions, and especially as you travel across the continent and you meet folks from all over, you're like, oh, okay, like there really is this misunderstanding of who I am as a Black person in this particular context.
I'm just trying to tread lightly on this. I'm just trying to tread lightly on this topic because I want to do more good than harm. So that's why I'm looking a little fidgety over here. Don't worry about me.
No worries. No worries. Yeah. And so it's interesting to think, again, like the Diaspora Wars are very real. How would you say that's played out in your interactions while living in Africa?
I will say, number one, I just want to say that wars it's such a nasty word. It's such a big word. It's just, and I don't like that. And this is something I just recently thought about when thinking about this topic, right? I don't know if wars is the best way for us to put it. I don't know what the best word would be. But I would also say that I'm not sure that we even know that we're interacting with each other in such a harmful way, which is the great thing about society, right? It's like you evolve over time. So things that were cool back in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s, we're not doing those things anymore, right? But I will say I have had a number of experiences that have given me Diaspora Wars vibes, and not purposely, but that's kind of how I would categorize it. So a little story time. A few weeks ago, maybe even up to a month, I was at a bar with friends, and I'm going to do my best to provide all the details of this evening because I was talking to another friend, and they told me that, I think we as people, we try to curate a very specific story, and it's like, let's just, keep all details there and let people take from it what they will. So it's a Saturday in Johannesburg. I live in Johannesburg for anyone who did not pick that up. I'm an expat. I've been here for about 3 years, so I've had some experiences. And maybe about a month ago, I'm at a bar It's a gay bar. It's a Saturday night. It's in Braamfontein. Um, and I'm with a friend who's with his guy friends. I'm kind of like sitting to myself. This random, very cute guy walks up to me, crop top. I mean, very cute, dressed for the evening. He walks up to me and just randomly is like, Black people scare me. And
Mm.
I'm like, there's music playing, there's drinks. So I'm not really sure what he says, but I'm like, what? I'm trying to hear what he's saying. And he says, Black people scare me. And like, I have a YouTube channel. So, but I'm not like by any means famous. So I'm like thinking that I'm this like random person that he just walked up to. Could he know that I'm a Black American? Because my first thought was like, does he mean Black Americans scare him? Because that would make sense. It's a South African person. Why would you say that to me? Right.
Mm.
If you can't possibly think I'm South African. Right. But then on the other hand, I was thinking, he could also be a person who is experiencing some self-hate for whatever reason at this moment in life.
Mm.
But for me, I kind of felt like either way, these are my people. Whether we're talking about South Africans or we're talking about Black Americans, he said, Black people are my people. So now I feel like I need to go on defense.
Mm.
It was a whole scene. Nothing too crazy happened. Fast forward to when things are dying down, maybe 5 minutes later. And I'm like telling him, like, you kind of wilding. Like, what's good with you? Like, why would you say that to me? That's like so crazy to say. Do you know he said, I don't even understand why you're so upset. Like, you really need to relax. Like, technically, I'm Blacker than you because I'm from here. I'm from here. So you don't even need to get that mad.
Oh.
And when I tell you, I think I was just like super speechless at such a response, right?
Mm.
Because I think for me, what I've experienced a lot of the time, and maybe even other Black Americans, is like, it might be an African person who's telling me, and I know African is very broad, it's not a specific country, but this could be anyone from any country on the continent. The energy is very much like, you're not one of us. So some could take that as like, you're African, right? Some also could take that as like, what level of Blackness are we, right? And so, but of course, no African person has ever said to me, I'm Blacker than you because I'm from the continent, until this person a month ago. Even though in my mind, I feel like that would somewhat be what the energy felt like sometimes, right?
Mm.
So you have like that intense experience. And, some people might feel like it was a 10-minute experience, like some random drunk person at the club. I posted it on TikTok and someone asked me, well, they might be colored. Are they colored? So it's kind of like, if this was a South African person talking to me, it felt like a little battle, right? And if it's a colored South African person who thought they were talking to a South African that was Black, or talking to another Black person, also, that feels like a battle. Like, it feels like you kind of ready for war a little bit,
So many layers.
Yeah.
Interesting. And I don't know if you explained it earlier, but like, for those that don't know, colored in South Africa means mixed race, right?
Yes. It means like a person who is of multiracial ethnicity, like ABAC, not necessarily like, oh, I have a white mom and a Black dad, or it's like, it goes back generations and in their family lineage.
Interesting.
So yeah.
Man, I mean, what an interaction. I don't know that I've ever experienced something similar, especially like when you're out at like a club just trying to have a good time. Like who's got the energy and the time to be having these super deep, conversations about identity.
Yeah.
So that's a very weird situation, and I'm sorry you had to experience that. But
Yeah.
yeah, it just again is another reminder of how much we don't understand each other and how prevalent, especially like anti-Blackness is
Mhm.
globally.
Girl.
Because if you, if that man, if that person was, let's say mixed race, black, white, it's
Mhm.
like maybe, like you said, there was that safe self-hatred, coming
Yep.
into play and saying like, okay, I'm maybe not happy with my black side. Um, or it could have been I don't know, a colorist thing. I don't know. Like
Yep.
there's so many layers and so many possibilities. Um, go ahead if you.
Yeah, I was gonna say that example too, when we're talking about diaspora wars, right? Like
Mhm.
that example that I just gave is kind of extreme, right? It's like,
Mhm.
all right, is somebody gonna walk up to you in the club and say that, right? But I can give a much shorter, different example that has nothing to do with me, right?
Mhm.
So when I first moved to South Africa, I was in consulting. So I'm like working in one of the big three consulting offices. I won't get too specific. And I'm talking to one of the she's a young consultant. I don't think that she's colored, but she is South African. And I moved here in like September 2019. So all I could talk about was in December, I'm going to Ghana. This year is the year of return. I'm going to Ghana, 2019, year of return. And I mean, I was telling everybody, right?
Mhm.
Do you know, I'm getting coffee with this, I was getting coffee with this girl, honey. And I'm like, yeah, girl. She's asking me, like, what are you doing for Christmas and New Year's? Because, it's a huge festive season in South Africa as well, the entire month of December. So
Mhm.
I'm like, I'll be gone for like the last 2 weeks of the month. I'm going to Ghana for year of return. I'm gonna be in Accra. I'm gonna do Afrochella. Da, da. She turned to me and said, "Oh, you going to real Africa?" I couldn't believe. I mean, I was in a
What?
chokehold in that moment. I said, "I'm sorry, what?" So, oh yeah, you going to real Africa? I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe it. And I feel like
Interesting.
that is like, I don't know, maybe that is like lack of exposure or South Africa considering themselves, the West of Africa. But to me, that felt very like anti-Africa, anti-Black. We're South Africa, so we're different, you know? Um, and again, someone might be like, nah, that's not diaspora wars. To me, I feel like it's like these small little things that kind of feed into the contentment that we have for each other across the diaspora. So for me, it's like those
Yeah.
kinds of actions. Like you dead ass just said Ghana is real Africa. We're okay, SA. So what are you?
You know, and I'm just thinking she obviously maybe lives in a bubble,
Maybe.
maybe in a pretty privileged bubble. And you could probably speak more to this, but from my understanding, South Africa is, very segregated, like class wise, like there's a huge divide as far as like, poor versus rich or,
Absolutely.
yeah, privileged versus like underprivileged. And so I would imagine maybe she doesn't interact with the everyday South African. And so to her, South Africa is, oh, the super developed, you know, not so African place.
I
That's
don't
so
know.
messed up.
I feel like that's a lot of credit. Not saying that no one in South Africa can come from that background, but I'm just saying like this person is probably our age, quite educated. She's at sorry. She's at this like top consulting firm,
Mhm.
right? So I know that she's smart. I know that she's capable. I know that like um you have to have some level of awareness of what's going on around you at a minimum, especially if we're thinking about South Africa, gender-based violence. We're
Mm.
thinking of like car the car snatch theft. that you have to like go through a briefing on when you first arrive in the country. It's like, I know you've seen a township in South Africa before. Like, I know you had, like, there's no way you can tell me that you have no interaction or understanding or idea of the conditions of the people who live around you. A majority of the people in this country.
Yeah.
That are Black.
That's a bit disturbing, considering how privileged that woman is and the types of decisions that she would be making on behalf of, different stakeholders. Like, knowing that she has that lens is a bit scary. But yeah, I mean, again, I think that's another example of anti-Blackness because, you're thinking of like, okay, let's say Ghana is this super African, the more real Africa, like, and
what does that mean?
Yeah, like, what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Like, goodness. Yeah, and I guess it's just disappointing to hear that in 2022 we can, I don't know what year that happened actually, but that in these modern times where people have plenty of access to information, it's disappointing to hear that we continue to hold just those ideas of African nations. I appreciate you like sharing your experiences. My experiences on the continent have obviously been very different, like given my identities. I'm African. I was born in Africa. And so, but it's interesting to think like, even though I am African, when I travel to the continent, when I travel back home, especially, I feel like I experience a few things that are similar to kind of what you shared earlier, as far as feeling like I get treated differently because of my now, I guess, Zambian American identity, like adding that American to it, I think has shaped a lot of like how people just perceive me. The privilege that I do have, but then I guess the misunderstanding of how much privilege I have, like people thinking I have more money or more access than I actually do. And so it's very interesting to navigate that. And a lot of times it honestly does make me feel uncomfortable just because I'm like, when I go back home, I just want to blend in and I just want to be a Zambian visiting my home country. But people are very quick to remind me that, girl, like you are very different from us. And that's, something that I've had to get accustomed to over time and something that I'm trying to, I guess, own a bit more. And I guess I'm trying to spin it in like a positive light, like to say like, okay, let's say I do have, which I do, let's say I do have this privilege, what can I do with it? Like, what sort of access do I have that can maybe be helpful to society? So I've over time started to like frame it that way versus like getting super offended that people are just pointing out how like not Zambian I am. But as far as like the diaspora wars go, I would say I've had mostly positive interactions with people from across the diaspora, whether they're, Black American or they're like, first generation American.
Very happy
to Yeah, and like growing up, I think it was, early on, like let's say middle school, like people just did not understand. People were like, I remember this one girl asking me like, "Oh, are you Black?" When I said like, I'm Zambian. I remember her asking me, "Are you Black?" And I was like, "Well, what? Yeah."
I think so.
I'm very Black. I'm from the land of Black people. Right. So it was interesting, I think, in that moment, because I think the girl that asked me that question also maybe didn't have an understanding of like what Blackness looks like outside of America, because she was an African American asking me. So maybe she hadn't had experiences with like foreign Blacks, like non descendants of like, American like chattel slavery. Like I think her exposure to African people was very limited. And so in that moment, she asked me that question, I think also just trying to gain an understanding of like, okay, like you look like me, but then you're not from here. Like, what does that actually mean? And again, that was middle school, like maybe 7th, 8th grade. So, we were just getting to the point where we're like really like learning about history and stuff. So I'm sure at that point, there wasn't an understanding that like there are a lot of new Black folks, I guess, migrating to the US. Like there's like a whole new wave of new immigrants, from, Black countries like coming to the US. So that's like one example that I can think of where there was just like a complete just disconnect. Yeah. So over time, though, as we've gotten older, I've gotten mostly positive experiences. And especially as I've gotten more comfortable, like just owning who I am and saying, yes, I'm a Zambian, this is my culture. The more boldly I shared it, the more people were just like, oh, tell me more. And the more curious they became versus like, I guess, ignorant. If that
That's
makes sense.
a really good point. That's a really good point. Like the idea of like kind of you leading with Zambian culture versus like someone walking up to you and being like, oh, what is this? Because I will say, I mean, Black Americans, we have a long way to go as well, as far as like understanding African culture, not contributing to Diaspora Wars as well. But I am happy to hear that. And again, it's kind of like what I was saying earlier about like just society evolving. I feel like our generation, we're like much more interested in like what each other's got going on.
Yeah, it's like a nice shift, I would say, because I think just hearing a lot of people's stories growing up, it's like, a lot of people had really traumatic experiences, interacting with folks from across the diaspora and people not understanding where they're from, people, mocking and making fun of the places that they're from. So it's like, I don't know that that's completely over. It probably isn't, but it's nice to see this like healthy shift towards people at least being more curious about like understanding each other.
And I mean, I quickly, I just want to say like, that kind of what I was referring to, like, I experienced that personally, like not personally, but going to high school with African students and seeing like people pick on them just because they're African. So I definitely will say that like a lot of, even in my like high school time, like that was something that was like a big deal and like very traumatic for a lot of African students and people who are probably from the area where I'm from as well. So for me, I feel like today what I do, again, like over time you learn, right? So for me, I'm like much more vocal about what anyone has to say about any African country or any African, especially my family. Like my grandma will be like, some Africa. I'm like, nah, grandma, you need to say Ghana. You're not talking about, this grandma I'm talking to, but this woman is nearly 80 years old. She don't really know nothing. So, I am trying to like do my best to be a person who's like also sharing the knowledge, because there is still a lot of ignorance, surprisingly, in 2022,
Absolutely. And again, I keep bringing it up, but I think it all comes from like anti-Blackness. And I find myself having similar conversations with, family or just people, in different like African communities here in the US. Like you still do hear negative things about like, let's say African Americans. And I always interrogate that because I'm like, why are you talking about a fellow Black person this way? Like, why do you sound like a white person? Like, why are you saying the same things?
I don't really go. You sound like a white person. It's like, whoa, what?
Because if you have the same talking points and the same stereotypes as like white people do about Black people, like, do you not know what you look like navigating through America? Like, you look Black. The first thing that people see is a Black person. They don't know that you're African or like foreign or whatever. So it's like those same ideas you have. It's like you're just pointing at yourself, essentially.
Yeah.
So clearly, globally, there just continues to be these misconceptions and misunderstandings of each other's cultures. How would you say we can foster like a better understanding of each other as folks across the diaspora?
That's a massive question. It's a massive question, but I'll take a stab at it. Because it is something that I think about often, just as a person who's had to move through like so many different diasporic spaces. And I'm trying to get good at it, but I was exposed to this writer and journalist named Esther Arma. I think she's from Ghana, and she wrote this book called Emotional Justice, a roadmap for racial healing. And I think her book is actually launching in Ghana like this week or something like that. I just saw it on her Instagram. So shout out to her. Okay. But she, I heard her speak one time about radical grace. Like she said, what we need, we as in like different parts of the diaspora, right? Like we really need to work on extending this like extreme level of grace to one another, because we are both, not even both, but like all parts of the diaspora are working through their own experiences with imperialism or colonization. And, it's not just one group who has a lot of work to do. We all have our own work to do. We're all kind of like scarred in our own way. And so this like first step would really be radical grace. And I feel like, we all could do that. We all could extend more grace. Black Americans can extend more grace. Different people from different parts of the diaspora on the continent can extend more grace, from the diaspora from South America, the Caribbean, beyond. Like, I think radical grace is like a good first step to kind of foster more understanding, because that way, like for instance, for me, I can like, not get so offended by someone asking me 3 times, where are you really from? And I can kind of take that as an opportunity to kind of just express, or share my story. Like, well, this is my story as a Black person of the diaspora. I know yours is different. This is what mine looks like. And vice versa, right? So
wouldn't that be beautiful?
It feels simple. It sounds good, right? But day to day, I don't know, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just thinking of like, when things are just kind of going crazy on Twitter. If people are like, hey, that hasn't been my experience, but
radical grace is a tool for social media. I wouldn't say that. I'm
not in that context.
Not in that context.
That's fair. That's fair. I mean, it's I think, like you said, it's a great first step. And we need to be able to really, really, extend each other that grace and be able to really like see each other, because if you see another Black person, it shouldn't be like, oh, like beef, like, oh, they look different, or like, where are you from? Like, like, I feel like we should be.
What set you rep? Like, whoa, we're all together.
All together. Yeah, I really wish we would all just say like, "Oh wow, like you have a beautiful name. Where is that
Yeah,
from? Where are your people
yeah,
from?" In like a way that's like really trying to seek understanding, and it's like coming from a place of curiosity and not from a place of like, all right, I need to know so I can start, assuming all these things about you and, where you might be
yeah,
from. Like,
yeah.
so there's definitely room for across the diaspora, there's definitely room for us to be just more graceful, and understanding of each other. Um, and, that's a great first step. How do you think we can challenge ourselves even more to learn more about each other?
Um, I would say just kind of using like the avenues that we're already engaging in. Like I feel like we get a lot of flack across the diaspora of like, y'all need to come together. We need to come together and, we need to learn more about each other. But I feel like one way that is already happening is through music. I'm talking from hip hop to Amapiano to Afro beats. Like,
Mm,
I don't know. I feel like Last is really bringing the diaspora together. You got Burna Boy
yes.
with the Tony Braxton sample. It's like, to me, that was a moment for the diaspora. That was like, okay, you know what? It might be little, the steps might be small, but we get in there. We get
Mm,
in there. We're understanding each other. So I feel like music is a great place to start because that's bringing these different cultures together, right? That's where you can learn more.
mm,
Um, and I also feel like that's the case with food,
mm.
um, and travel. I feel like it's coming slowly but surely, but continuing to do those things, engage in the arts, engage in travel. Um, I think those avenues for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree. And today, in 2022, it's so easy to tap into each other's cultures in that way,
Yeah.
music, movies, go
Yeah.
on Netflix and watch, African content, watch
Yep.
Black content from the US. Like, there's just so many ways we can really, really just engage with each other's cultures in an authentic way, and just start to learn even more about each other. So I'm so happy that that's like just more accessible, um,
Yeah.
in 2022. Um, and another thing I always think about, is just for us to have like a greater understanding of just our histories, and how similar a lot of our histories are, and how for decades now, maybe even centuries, we've been working towards fostering greater understanding, like across the African diaspora. Like these conversations that we're having, like this conversation we're having, like this
Yeah.
is this is not the first time, people have gathered from across the diaspora to discuss, how we can collaborate more, how we can understand each other more. Um, and I think it's really important for us to know like history, because if you look
Yeah.
back, for instance, like as a lot of like African nations were beginning to like gain independence,
Mhm.
Ghana is an example, I'm thinking of. Like it happened in 1960. Ghana was like the first, sub-Saharan African country, I believe, to gain independence. And in 1960, if you think about it, like the Civil Rights Act in the United States hadn't even passed yet. So it's like,
Yep.
African nations were, cutting off those colonial ties. But then, the work was still happening towards like achieving like, equity in the United States. And
Yep.
there were plenty of examples of leaders of different movements across the diaspora, like getting together to share ideas, to inspire each other. And even like at Ghana's independence, it was, attended by leaders across the globe, and Black leaders, especially Martin Luther King, John Lewis, I believe. Yes, he was also there. So it's like, it's so interesting to think that, that was the early 60s, and these, prominent like civil rights leaders were like going to Ghana to celebrate with Africans, to say like, wow, like liberation, this is super inspiring. We are hoping for the same, where we're from, essentially. And so I think it's like super eye-opening to just think of those types of examples, because then we know like, oh, like we don't have to be like at war. We don't have to misunderstand each other. Like we can actually like inspire each other to do like and achieve that much more.
Yeah. And I mean, that's such a great point. I feel like I am always surprised or taken aback when I'm watching maybe some like historical movie or a documentary, and there's like some Black American with a sign that's like end apartheid in South Africa. And I'm like, oh, they really been on it. And it just makes me think about like Shirley Chisholm, the first Black woman or person to like put in a bid for presidency back in the 70s. Like there is documentation of her efforts to, put economic pressure on South Africa's apartheid government because of the conditions in this country. So, for me, it's just like, all right, well, you're right. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. Our ancestors and people who came before us, this is something that they've been trying to like, kind of demonstrate to us that like you have, you're a part of something greater, and, use your voice for them as well, think beyond, the diaspora of what you see and where you are. Like there's so much more to us.
Absolutely. And it's like, in so many ways, like we're facing like similar issues, like social issues. We're fighting very similar battles. We're trying to achieve the same things. We're trying to break, generational curses and build wealth. And like a lot of us are just now having the opportunity to do so. And it's like really, really just an interesting time. And like, if someone in Africa is experiencing that, and then, another person in America is experiencing the same thing, it's like, we have more in common than I think we think. So
sure.
It's really important for us to know, like, we're all kind of, trying to work towards the same thing. And we can actually foster like, just more unity, more progress, and we can like, exchange ideas and help each other just advance in so many ways. So super, super important. And I always end with, what excites you about Africa's future?
I love this question. And it's not going to be a super like complicated answer. I think what excites me the most about Africa's future is the Black people across the world actually coming to explore the continent. So the cultural exchange that's happening between like Black people in the West and Black people on the continent and other parts of the world, through events like, Afrochella or Year of Return or, expat life. I find it so exciting that there are so many Black people who are actually like paying attention to the continent, and they want to spend their money here and they want to come and vacation here, because if for whatever reason, maybe they know nothing about it and they have the most ignorant ideas of it, at least to me, it's like, nah, that's cultural exchange. Someone is coming here, they're gonna learn what it's really like. More of us doing that, more younger people, our generation, our kids. I feel like by the time the next generation comes, I think it'll be a much more of a global, like the diaspora will be much more connected. Way the things seem. I mean, that's my guess. I know that might be a little hopeful, wishful thinking, but I'm banking on it. I'm banking on it.
Absolutely. I mean, likewise, I'm just as excited to see more people traveling to the continent, more people just be curious about it. And so, yeah, it's definitely like a great time to be in at this moment. And so you share a lot of, your experiences and on the continent on your YouTube channel. Could you share a bit more about it and how people can like find it?
Happily. So my YouTube channel is Jazzy Jet Sets, JAZZY JETSETS. And I basically use this as an opportunity or a platform to talk about my experience as an expat living in South Africa, what it's like being Black American on the continent, and also really trying to shed light on what it's like and how exciting or interesting it is to travel throughout the continent. So traveling to different African cities, showing like the really cool and fun side, the luxury side, maybe the not so luxury side. So yes, please subscribe to my YouTube channel and check it out if you are interested in learning more about what it's like living on the continent, 7,000 miles away from family. And my Instagram is also the same, which is Jazzy Jet Sets. And I think we'll have links for those or actual labels anyway. So yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for being a guest, Jasmin. This was such an awesome conversation.